All right, hi everybody. So my name's Darren Haken. I'm head of engineering at AutoTrader. So I actually look after one of what we call our tribes there. So we've got what we call a platform engineering tribe. So I look after specifically trying to build our whole platform that our kind of engineering teams work with. And one of the big areas that I've been focusing on over the last few years is actually building one segment of our platform, which we call our data platform. And so I've been spending the last maybe 4 or 5 years going really deep in the sort of big data, machine learning space, but purely from an engineering perspective. So trying to focus on how do we build out these capabilities, right, and help people across our engineering org. But my background is general engineering, so I come from a consultancy background, so Java, microservices, DevOps, cloud, all that kind of stuff, but been very interested in this kind of data space now for many years. And through that, one of the areas that I'm going to talk about today is this metadata ecosystem problem, but I'm going to specifically do that with this other technology called DBT. So the kind of rough structure for the talk, so I'm going to actually start a little bit by actually talking about AutoTrader and our kind of data journey into this more decentralized model. So that's, spreading out the use of data across the organization. And then kind of talking and bringing us back to the kind of centerpiece of this talk, metadata, and why I think this is a really hot topic and important. And then finally, I want to talk a bit about what can we do in industry to kind of move this topic forward. Because I actually think that it's very kind of new, ill-established, but super promising, right? So we need to band together and work, and that's how I believe in open source software, and that's why I'm here today. Okay, so a little bit about AutoTrader to begin with, some context. So I don't know if everybody here or remotely will know who AutoTrader are, but they're the largest automotive marketplace in the UK. We've been established since 1977. And I actually went and did a bit of a Google and looked at some imagery of the very first time AutoTrader were established. We're actually called Thames Valley. And I'm actually a little bit confused. It just amazed me, this picture, actually, because it looks so old. If there were horses and carriages on there and they were selling horses, I would not be shocked. It's really quite some journey. But now we're kind of a fully digital marketplace. You can go to autotrader.uk, look at cars, and crucially, we're also moving more to how do we make that a full digital experience. Basically, how do you buy a full car online? And things like COVID have obviously made that far more enticing for you. The sentiment of consumers are kind of up for it. And for scale, because this is helpful, I think, when we talk about data, the site has got about 58 million cross-platform visits per month. So we're not, Google, huge data, but I remember reading the stat, I think it's like the 12th largest UK site in terms of traffic in the UK. So it's not bad, right? It's reasonable. Medium data, not big data, probably. But to give, to talk about AutoTrader's journey, and I'm not going to go through all of it because, it's a long time, 1977 until now. But there's sort of a journey, right? We started out as a magazine, just after horses and carriages by the looks of it. But I imagine analytics was very much, probably paperwork actually to begin with, but actually I've started the journey digitally by saying probably they started analytics, spreadsheets and, exploring numbers. And then we went through this kind of data warehousing journey that a lot of organizations do. Then we started looking at things like data lakes and machine learning, and then crucially the kind of thing that I focus on now at AutoTrader, which is like building platform capabilities. And we're moving more into a direction of something called a data mesh, which is an architectural paradigm that I'm actually going to touch on a little bit later. So I'm going to zoom in on 2 of these stages. I think we need to talk about spreadsheets. We all know what a spreadsheet is. But the first, one of the earlier stages where kind of AutoTrader went big on data and invested was this data warehouse chapter. We had a 60-person kind of team working, focused, very central, working on data, and they had very hyper-specialized skills. So I imagine things like Talend and graphical ETL tools and data warehousing. And I just looked online and started looking at, the very archetypical, classic data warehouse stack, and I think this sort of covers it. So for those that don't know, you've got lots of data sources, centralize all your data into a data warehouse, and then typically the use case is BI and reporting. And so that was a chapter in AutoTrader's life, and it helped, right? It was far, far better than the spreadsheet paradigm, far, far better. But, and crucially, it's probably one of the failure modes of this centralization for us was, although that team were doing a great job and serving the rest of the organization, they couldn't keep up with the demand of the organization. And, it's a victim of its own success. So you start and you say, great, now we have we're a 1,000-person org, 60 FTE, and essentially, like they just could not keep up with the demand of everybody wanting to work with data. And the more data people got, the more demand went up. There's this amazing visualization, which it's not me actually. So I don't know if you know a company called Looker, but they're a very huge BI tool out there in the analytics space. And the founder wrote this article that's actually been taken down, which is really a shame. I actually looked through it when I was writing this talk, but it's not there anymore. But he talks around this sort of data breadline, and he described, the impoverished nature of people accessing data in organizations to be analogous to kind of the Great Depression. Now, it's not as bad, clearly, as people starving to death, so he's not saying that, but I still think it's a really stark picture, and I actually do imagine it in the very physical sense of just a queue of people lining up, hoping to kind of work and access data and use it in the organization. So although that was a good time for us in terms of far better than spreadsheets and far better than probably pieces of paper scattered around the office, which was before digital, it just wasn't good enough for us. And so we've been moving on that timeline towards sort of about platform thinking, building a data platform, and actually data mesh. And so I'm going to talk a little about the data mesh, and it's more of a very high-level sweep across it. And the reason for that, and it's to talk about this other chapter in AutoTrader's journey, is I think that, AutoTrader have been on this journey for quite some time, like many years actually, looking at platforms. But this data mesh is an architecture that's been talked about a lot recently. It's got a lot of attention. And for me, that's given me this vocabulary to talk about this next stage, right? It's a shared language that we can work through, which is powerful. And I think it's the same with microservices. Like, a lot of people were already doing microservices, but then the microservice model comes around and people talk about it, and it gives us a language to communicate with each other. And I think that's really powerful. I think it's really powerful that data mesh can do that for analytics and data engineering. So for the people that don't know, so a quick, very high level, but honestly, I could do a whole talk on data mesh, so I can't cover it all. But generally, so the data mesh is a shift from a centralized paradigm of lakes, data warehousing, to one that focuses more on the sort of modern distributed architectures. And its aim is to address common failures of the traditional centralized model and unlock data at scale, which all sounds brilliant because it sounds like a lot of the things, the shift from centralized paradigm, well, yes, we were in a centralized paradigm. We did have some common failure modes, usually with scale. And obviously, we would like to unlock some more of our data. Who wouldn't? So data mesh has 4 principles: domain ownership, data as a product, a self-serve data platform, and then federated computational governance. So these are the 4 principles that underpin the data mesh architecture. And I can't go through all of the detail on the mesh, but I'm going to give you my kind of very high-level spin on that and how I can apply that to what I've been doing at AutoTrader with the rest of my colleagues. So the high-level notion of self-serve data platform really is to provide capabilities to serve the organization, right? So rather than bringing work into that central team, they focus on building this platform that takes and generates capabilities. So maybe, I don't know, how to do machine learning efficiently, right, without all of the inertia around maybe Spark provisionment, or how do you work with data wells, and how do you build things with data and take away some of the noise. And we've got similar things, right, with microservices. People build platforms to do CI/CD, deploy applications, and just temporarily take away that pain, and it's the same idea. And the key aspects I find really appealing is you build these capabilities to make data available and accessible to generalists. So rather than them hyper-specialized individuals that we had in the centralized model, we try to abstract complexity through a platform to allow a standard, a non-specialized software engineer, etc., data analyst, data scientist to work with data. And so that's that component there of eliminating complexity. And crucially, I think, it's not just about engineers, it's not just about technical practitioners, like data practitioners. It's actually designed to serve many roles with a platform. So, it could also be a marketer, an executive, a business partner. It's about giving access and capabilities to everybody in the organization. So one of the other components, I sort of bundled two of the principles together, which is domain ownership and data products. I think they've got quite a lot of cohesion between them. So you kind of got this decentralizing the data closer to the people. So rather than having a central team of hyper-specialized individuals, you decentralize the data and you move it closer to product teams. So I don't know if you've got a product team that's working on like billing or like purchasing, maybe like an order payment system, right? Like you bring the data to them and say, well, you build out analytics that talk about, I don't know, the performance of the billing systems, or you know, which people generally use your product more than others, that kind of thing. And the other component of that is applying product thinking. So rather than treating data as just this data, to start looking at it as, well, how do we build that into a product, right? And it's a similar notion to general software engineering. Rather than focusing on lines of code and programming languages, we actually think, well, that's a system and it's a product and it solves a problem. And so that's the idea. And then the final point of that with the data product aspect is it's building products around data in your organization and having customers. So it could be internal people. So you could build, I don't know, a grouping of data that represents something like recommendations maybe for consumers. And then data scientists maybe are a customer of that because they use it to do machine learning and modeling, and that's the general idea. So I've said the word data products quite a few times. And so just to sort of demystify that slightly, in the data mesh architecture, what they talk about as a data product, it's almost that full system. So it's code, it's the infrastructure that runs it. So if you've got, I don't know, a Spark job or a DBT package that executes some code, that's part of your data product, and it's also any of the data that it needs or generates. And so this decentralization component could look something like this. And this is not quite how AutoTrader looks, but I thought some of these structures might make sense to a general audience. So rather than one giant data monolithic team and technology, you could end up with more sort of domain-orientated structure. You could have more of a sales domain. You could have like a buyer's domain. So AutoTrader are a marketplace, so very clear segments for us are buyers and sellers. And so for the buyers, maybe there's some kind of data products where we look at like how do we do recommendations, and other things like that, right? So it's decentralization. So our journey to that, so obviously I can't talk about everything that we've built around building a self-serve platform, so I'm going to zoom in and go through now talking about this technology called DBT. So when we looked at building capabilities for AutoTrader, one technology we have invested in is DBT, and that's a tool that allows people to process data, and I'll talk a little bit more about that for people that don't know what it is. But generally, we've been investing in it for a few years now, and anyone that's a practitioner or AutoTrader seems to love DBT. There's a general warm feeling about it, which is great. So that's why we've been invested in bringing that up as a capability. So what is DBT? So if anyone's heard of anything like infrastructure as code, or making everything as code, that's the general idea of DBT. So you have these SQL files, they're templatable, so you can kind of substitute various components in it, a bit like you can inject functions and like arbitrary points of SQL, but that all gets checked into version control, which is great. Also, I don't know if you can see, I'm sorry, it's a little bit hard to recognize, but on the from line near the bottom, there's this sort of ref function. So it has a set of functions it provides, but what it also allows you to do is build up a graph. So you can have all these SQL files, and you can have them linked together. And the best way of explaining how you use this is to probably talk about its architecture and the adjacent technologies to it, and they kind of help paint a picture of where it kind of sits in a data stack. So for AutoTrader, on the left, you've kind of got the data sources. This is where we've operational systems, SaaS solutions, and we want the data, right? So it could be Postgres stores, it could be, Google Analytics, it could be Salesforce, it could be any kind of platform that your organization, that there's some data they want that's a source. And so for us, we've actually ingested that data into our data platform using Apache Kafka for any internal systems, and then we also use a technology called Fivetran, which acts as a really easy way of kind of getting SaaS data into our platform. And then we stage that data, we ingest that and stream it into BigQuery, which is a data warehouse, but also it's a little bit kind of data lakey in the sense that you can kind of store tons of data, and it's a lot more flexible than maybe some of the older data warehouses. And then DBT sits just after that. So you can write these SQL files, maybe some kind of aggregation, like select these columns and do a sum, something like that. and then it will execute on your data warehouse, and it will generate output data sets, right? So you could have something like an orders table, and then you could write some DBT maybe that aggregates orders by day or total orders per customer, and then you could write that out as a new data set. And so it actually uses your data warehouse to execute the data, spits it back out, and then you've got a new data set. And that's how DBT works. And then we use Looker a lot of the time, which I mentioned earlier with one of the other slides. And that's one of the ways that we present this data and give people access. So we use DBT, and one of the things I could say, which is brilliant when I focus on platforms and helping people across my organization, is we've seen an explosion in data practitioners through using DBT. This is kind of a commit log. So at the moment, we have a mono repo, which makes some of this analysis a little bit easier. But you know, like I think I was even playing around with it at 2019 with a couple of engineers on one of my teams. So I'm like one of probably 4 on that beginning graph, and now we've kind of moved up to kind of 60 people across, but that's crucially across the organization. And that's of about 200 engineers as well, so we're about 200 engineer company, 1,000 overall headcount. And to kind of see this again, we've got this explosion of users, so we've got people on Slack now, asking to have pull requests reviewed, so maybe they ask a peer, or maybe someone in one of the other teams, can you just review my kind of DBT code and check it's all up to date? But that's good, because this is showing a thriving community. Not so good when I was looking at this, which did alarm me a little bit actually, which is quite apt actually, given where I'm going to take this next through the talk, is we've got 79 active pull requests, which is a lot. And that was really not good, because I was like, wow, that means we're really not keeping up right with that, and that's just not going to scale, so that worries me. But nonetheless, it is an explosion of users, and we can't really deny that. So to bring that together, Mesh and DBT, the combination, going back to that kind of decentralized view yet again, what it means is you've got this, we've applied this data mesh to our org, so we've now got distribution of people working with data. They're embedded in these domains, and each one is kind of doing DBT development as part of building their data products, amongst other technologies as well. But distributing our data across org has created a new set of challenges. So whilst we're starting to be able to scale, and we've broken the centralization problem a little bit, it isn't a silver bullet, right? And it comes with its own sets of challenges. That's what I'm going to talk about a little bit now, and then bring that into metadata. So challenges. So the first challenge that I'm going to talk about a little bit is this sort of ownership / maintainers. Now, I don't know who any of you are software practitioners, probably, given the nature of the audience. But I think it's a generally recognized practice that owning software and owning, you know, microservices or code bases and owned by teams is a good thing. We reckon, you know, ownerless stuff, not good, leads to very bad things. Well, we did a bit of analysis and found that 20% of all of our DBT models were in fact ownerless, maintainerless, or maybe they were, but we didn't know who they were. And I'm not trying to give a bad rep for DBT actually, because this is not a specific problem to DBT. It's just easy to talk about it through the context of DBT. Other tools also have that problem. So we use Airflow, we use Spark, many other tools. Annoyingly, we can't get accurate stats of them, but DBT was a little bit easier to audit. I'll just save questions to the end. Is that okay? Just to make sure I'm on time, but hold your thought. I'll write it down. Great, fantastic. Okay. Yeah, and so I mentioned Looker is a tool that we use as an analytical tool on top of DBT. And so that's actually used by non-technical people a lot of the time, executives, marketeers, etc. And Looker is referencing some of this ownerless data, 74 references in fact, when we did the audit, which is also a little bit scary because they want to trust things that we're saying, I don't know who owns that, you know, and that's a bit of a clash. So, you know, some of the problems then, I know I'm kind of covering it, but who are the maintainers when we need a change to happen? No organization is static, right? So if we've built something, usually it's going to need some change, or if not, we need to sunset it, but still the same kind of problem, right? Who are the stakeholders? Who cares about this data? And then the one that matters to me when I think about building platforms is about sort of stability. Who resolves a problem with it? So even just assume for a second, you know, it's all working great, but if there's a bug, there's a problem with it, and it's affecting production, who is going to address that? So one of the other areas where we've had some challenges is sharing data. But not sharing data, that's been fine, that's been easy. But sharing data responsibly is where it's been challenging. So, you know, teams depending on other teams' data without permission, which is what I'm really saying by sharing responsibly, is, you know, you have some data, like some customer data or, I don't know, some orders. And I'm like, oh, I would like to use that data in my development, please. Can I take that data? Well, that'd be great, because then you're giving permission back. But if not, and I just take that and you're not aware of it, that's where this irresponsible behavior can happen. And actually, we found that with our DBT setup, that's certainly the case. And the way I describe that then is there's no contracts, right, between teams. So if I can take your data and use it in my product and you don't know, there's no contracts, it's unexpected coupling as well. We're now bound to each other, but you don't really know it. And then we've seen other issues like multiple sources of truth, because people can easily reference each other's stuff. There's no, I guess, like governance layer there to say, no, don't reference that one. Reference this customer data. This is the one you want to depend on. And so that maybe starts to drift into, do we have any confidence issues there or trust issues with the data? And this isn't to say we can't restrict data. So this isn't oh my God, anyone can access personal data at AutoTrade, and absolutely not. It's just that at the moment, restricting access is, I guess, more expensive and manual. So a lot of our data we actually anonymize. So it's open for sharing, and that's what we want. We want as much of an open platform as possible, but we also don't want people to, take data from other people and not really understand the implications of it. And I don't try and, you can have a go, but I wasn't putting this up for you to try and read every node in this visualization. But when data sharing goes wrong, which is the legitimate thing that happens with AutoTrader, we had this team at the top, this sort of root node, and they're what we call our stock team. So they basically do like inventory management. If people list cars on AutoTrader, they're like the central repository of that kind of information. Well, they built some analytical data products, and then lots of other teams had referenced that data because it's a very important, useful data set actually to do analytics on, but they didn't know all these people were using it. And then we had a production incident where there was a bug in one of the data products, and then, huge cascade and huge blast radius there, and that wasn't good. It was bad. And then discoverability, actually. So I think this is a good and bad thing. This is happening, but it does worry me a little bit. So now we have people in Slack being like, hey, I'm looking for some data. Does anyone know where I can find data X or data Y, or I need some understanding of what this data product does? And so that means we've got that explosion of users. We've got that thriving community, but we also now have sort of leaked into Slack, right, as our discoverability mechanism. And so I guess that's again going to cause problems with are people finding the right data? Is this the right use case for this data? Because it might say it's customer data, right? But it could be within a bounded context or a domain where it means a very different thing. And so that's not great. And then we don't really want to rely on this like tribalism. You'll reach a limit on scale there yet again when people, there's just too much data for everybody to know about, right? So you've got missed opportunities now. There'll be, I think it's sometimes called like dark data, right? Or something like the bits that people can't see. So yet again, we need a scalable way to overcome these challenges. So the centralized model is pretty good because we lack scale through that, right, with the centralized model. We've gained some scale. Now we've sort of lost a bit of quality through the scale. And now we need to kind of rebalance, and maybe we've over-indexed in some of this stuff through the challenges. But that's good. I see it as a good thing. I'd rather go a bit further away from centralization, gain some agility, and then have to rein it back. So that's how I feel about it. The obvious way to fix that would be, well, let's just get all the humans involved. Let's start a governance practice. Let's, increase the pull requests that people look at. Let's, commit some more people to it, etc. But I don't think that's scalable. And we know that, right, through software engineering, that our best tool that we have to gain scale and stability is generally automation. Through test-driven development, through automating deployments, the whole 9 yards. So that's what I think. So I was looking at this and say, well, how do we address these challenges through automation, not through humans. And people talks about that. People are like, oh, well, we could just get more people reviewing things. I'm like, no, that will not scale. We'll literally just be going back to the centralized model, really, by having a central set of reviewers. So this is where I hope metadata is the hero, or it could be a hero. So hopefully everybody knows what metadata is, but, data about data. And the good news with DBT is DBT supports capturing metadata. It has done now for a couple of years. So I showed you a SQL file, which you can commit. That's basically like your transformation with DBT. They also support these kind of YAML files that sit alongside your transformation, and it lets you capture various components. You could, like the name and other stuff like that, and descriptions and everything. But they've added this meta block, and that's basically just a dictionary, a list of key values. And in this example, this isn't from AutoTrader, this is from the DBT docs. They've basically come up with this idea of something called owner, who is at Alice, and this other key, model maturity, which is in dev. So I quite like this idea that DBT's introduced this, because now we can capture metadata about the code base. It's all checked into version control together. So we've essentially encapsulated model code and metadata and put them into the same repository. And when it's in a repository, the great thing we can do is we can start to look at how we integrate this into CI/CD, right? Either continuous integration, continuous deployment, pipelines, and so on. So this is a kind of CD pipeline-ish look that we do at AutoTrader. So GitHub just meaning a version control system. So we check that in, and then a build will happen in our CD CI tool, and it will compile this DBT and do a build stage. And we can actually then hook in there, and we've written some code to do that, and build out almost automated policies around our metadata, and I'll get into what I mean by that in the next section. We actually use a tool called Airflow to execute these DBT models, and so that'll happen periodically, hourly, daily, whatever, right? And when new data comes in, you get new transformations on that data. And one of the other kind of hooks that I'm going to talk about is this bottom right piece, which is we can take that metadata and we can synchronize that into the broader ecosystem of tools that exist in the data world. So automated policies, I'll talk about that first. So this is an actual meta block from some of the things that we've come up with at AutoTrader. We've come up with a convention. We've prefixed like metadata that should be encapsulated and cohesive together. And so in this example, we've come up with data governance as a prefix, and we'll say anything that's related to data governance, we'll keep that all bundled under a kind of a namespace, as it were. And so we've got stuff like business owner, team owner, data for classification. So we played around with the idea of like public and private, which is coming from our software backgrounds. And when we've got this metadata, what we can do is we can start to define policies at the build stage, a bit like linting for anyone that's used a linter, really, but more domain-specific linting, right, than just general technology, this is good, this is bad, of how it's structured. And we could do things like, well, I'll check for this metadata and make sure that all the models that compile have an owner. And if they don't, we won't, the build will fail. Maybe other teams can only use production models, so data lifecycle, if it's in development or testing, or I don't know, there's an alpha, whatever kind of lifecycle kind of policies or stages that you want to come up with in your organization, you could still start to say, well, we won't let other teams reference that data. Or maybe this PII flag, like only the security team can access that data. No other kind of data products can because it's PII or something, right? Whatever it is. These are just examples. And we've kind of built up in Python. This is the actual code like snippet, just more of an array, right, of these rules, and inspired by linters, really. So there'll be a bunch of rules. We can add rules as we go along, and then when we do the build, it will enumerate through them and check. And then you can see like an actual build fail that happened from CI/CD, where it's saying, this model failed, the checks didn't pass. Actually, this model didn't even have any metadata, so we're really far away from you getting into production. But crucially, it wouldn't get into production, which is great. And so these are the kind of things that I find very interesting, and maybe it does give us that scale that I was talking about needing with quality, because that 20% ownerless problem, we can address that now through metadata. And so many other things, and like the teams now, are, it's an evolving and thriving set of policy that we're looking at and putting in place, and hopefully try and drive down the pull requests, because actually PR reviews is also a hang-up of humans, right? We need to automate as much of that as possible. So ecosystem is the other aspect of it. So going back to the kind of CI/CD diagram I had earlier, I've unbundled that synchronize on the right, and I'm just going to go through two examples of synchronizing into the ecosystem with this metadata. So we're exploring this tool at the moment called Data Hub. Data Hub is a metadata store, data catalog, sometimes they're called that, but it's a central place to push metadata, and they give you various capabilities when you do that, and that's one we're exploring, and I'll talk about that a little bit after. And then Monte Carlo is a monitoring data observability tool. So we can grab that metadata and maybe push it to that as well. So that's used, I guess, similar to like New Relic maybe, or a Datadog, but it's specifically built around analytics. So it'll look for things like anomalies in your data. It's very different to monitoring operational systems, right? Like you need to look for anomalies, Cartesian products are wrong, that kind of thing. And Monte Carlo does that through its ML. So that's another product that we've pushed out to the ecosystem. So I'll go through the Monte Carlo one first, just to show that. So we've come up with another namespace for metadata. You can see there's a structure to this in terms of how we've approached it. So anything to do with observability, monitoring, we've prefixed with data observability, seems sensible. And then we've got a bunch of different things that matter. The one I highlight the most is this notification channel. So imagine that's basically saying there's a notification channel, which is a Slack channel, that in the event of a problem with your data, we were going to use that metadata to tell Monte Carlo, notify that team through their Slack channel, because that's what they've put in the metadata, and we're driving that through the code base. And then the other things are, they're specific to Monte Carlo, but these are basically, you can tell Monte Carlo, these dimensions or these fields are things I'm very interested in. These are really important to my organization. So they will basically then build ML and monitor them particular fields, right? They're looking for anomalies in them in particular. But again, this is just a whole set of metadata that we've captured through our DBT process. And then, to kind of show that then, so using the CI/CD post building and deploying and releasing to production, the DBT will push that out into Monte Carlo. So on the left is Monte Carlo, and so it will set up a bunch of health monitoring and so on. And then on the right is one of them alerts in Slack, so it went wrong, and Monte Carlo knows, okay, that's the team's Slack channel, so I'll send it to that. So that's the observability part with the ecosystem. And then the other area is discoverability then, or specifically this kind of metadata store. So I talked about Data Hub. So what we can do with this metadata is we can synchronize it into a central metastore like Data Hub. And we can also do that with lots of other tools that we use. So maybe we've got Airflow, we've got Spark. Everything's got metadata actually. There's stuff going on in all of your technology, and we can push that into this metastore. And then we can aggregate it too, and we can make sense of it. That's the idea of this metadata store. So you bring all that metadata together from disparate systems and give you more of a unified view of your platform. And one of the great things they offer is searching. They're usually backed by Elastic or some kind of searching data store, but they do give you full text search. So in this example, on the right, we've done a search for a sessions table, which is web traffic and sessions, and then it's come through. And I know it's hard to see maybe on the slide, but these kind of fields under properties, I don't know if you can make it out, it's a little bit blurry actually, sorry about that. But the data governance components I talked about earlier are now in Data Hub, and that means we can search on them as well. So for example, I could search for all data products or data assets owned by Darren, and I could search for that. And it would come up and say, here you go, here's everything we know. And that's been all driven through our metadata, which is nice, right? And we've now got policies in place to make sure, if there isn't any metadata, we're going to fail the build. So we're starting to move back to almost that federated governance, actually, right? We're governing how the health of our products but we're letting people kind of have the autonomy to work on it decentralized. And what I hope, because this is still early days, so I'm kind of showing this as it's a work in progress, is I'm hoping it will reduce the tribal knowledge, right? So rather than going to Slack and being like, hey, can I have some data? Does anyone know where I can find some data? They can use this tool to search for things and find the right data. So I'm going to go through one last section, which was actually the point of the reason I actually did this talk in the first place, which is where do we go from here? So I'm hoping you've seen metadata and thought, oh, yeah, this would be a really great thing. If I'm doing any analytical work, I can see the power of metadata, and we could use it in all sorts of different ways. But where do we go from here? Well, for one, to take this forward, we need centralized metadata. And even though, so to this point, we can't make DBT the only source of metadata within AutoTrader in our organization. There's a company called LakeFS who they do this each year, but they basically take a snapshot of all the data tooling that's out there and being actively used and group it. But basically bloody loads, and it's always growing, and it's insane actually how many tools there are. There's like 4 different orchestrators, 7 warehouses, I don't know, but there's absolutely loads of stuff. And every organization uses several technologies, right? There's no company that just uses DBT. Maybe if you're, I don't know, a 4-person org, and that's fine. And you probably don't need metadata then, because you can just ask your colleague, do you know what data we have? And they'll be like, well, of course, we're a 4-person company. Of course, I can tell you all the data we have. But if you're a big company, you've got lots of tools. And so I think we need to centralize that and bring that together. And there are centralized meta stores, and I've mentioned one, Data Hub. I've really wanted one of these centralized metadata stores since I started working and specializing in data engineering and analytics as part of the platform that we build. But it is an unsolved problem, actually. So these 3 are the ones that I find look to be the most interesting and promising. I'm sorry if there's other ones that you know about. It's a rapidly changing space. But Data Hub used to be LinkedIn, I think, and now they've got VC funding, and it's they're starting to build out SaaS solutions for it, which is what we're looking at. And Munzen's a similar story. I think that was from Lyft, yeah. And then I can't remember where Marquez was from. WeWork. There you go. There you go. You know your stuff. Hopefully your question will be good at the end now then.
It's really a trivial question, really.
Right. Yeah, and then there's a bunch of other ones. Like I've looked at Google. We use Amazon, AWS, and Google Cloud, which is hence BigQuery came up in the architecture. But I've tried Google's catalog. There's something called Atlan that I've seen recently. There's just but it's an emerging space. There is not a New Relic, a Datadog. There's not like the established. If you want to do monitoring, go and use these technologies. But we need it. And so one of the areas that I'm interested in the industry focusing on is this missing primitive. And we saw a similar thing, right, with microservices. For anyone that is crossing the chasms of operational microservice development and analytical work, there's a bunch of things when microservices started becoming popular that did not exist, that people started developing, like tracing, networking policies, containerization and Kubernetes brought that forward, but there was gaps in the distributed model, and I think the centralized meta stores need to kind of catch up to help us address some of that. And of course, with all of that technology, one of the other things that I think we lack is this idea of standardized metadata. Now, 2 examples I gave you were data governance and also observability. So, the idea of capturing metadata by owners and other key fields. I can't believe for a second that AutoTrader is unique that they want to capture these things. They seem quite applicable to the rest of industry, but we lack standards. So, we've built our own schema, essentially. But the problem with that is we're going to have a huge cost of integrating all that across all of these tools. So I'm interested in these sort of specifications to come around for things of these key concepts. And hopefully these standards will help the ecosystem thrive, right? Because people can bolt in, and that's how we build an ecosystem. And, to that end, there are a few standards worth looking at. Open metadata has just come out, but they're also a data catalog, and that's, again, it's confusing. But this is from their website, but they've tried to almost come up with this ontology, this classification system of all different kind of assets and the fields that it would have, and so on. And so I'm sure there'll be other attempts at that. There's Open Lineage, which I think was invented by the guy that made Parquet. But that's another area of like lineage is another problem. Like how do you know how things connect together? And so again, there's a attempt at a standard for Open Lineage. And so these are the kind of things that I think will help. So if all these catalogs, build their own domain-specific schemas, migrating between them will be painful, integrating will be painful, using other tools when they emerge will be painful. This is why I hope some standards may help with that. And yeah, to kind of finish off then, before questions, the reason I did this talk then was a call to arms, because I would like more people to appreciate the need for this component in analytical data engineering, data platforms, whatever word you use. I hope you feel that the need is there, we need it. Well, the only way we're going to do that for open source is if we build things together. And so this was the point of this talk for me was, please go and check out all the catalogs I showed you, even though they're SaaS solutions, they're open source backed, and then they make an open source model. So you could contribute to them. You could join Slack channels on Open Lineage and, build out specifications with people. So that's the call to arms is, contribute, build open source around it, and that's how we'll kind of take this and solve it. Because even though AutoTrader has done some things I think are kind of interesting, I want to see what everybody else can do, right? And, we're only one organization. Innovation happens when open source kind of gets there and shows more with it. So the takeaways from the talk for me is these distributed teams for us introduced new challenges. Metadata is a powerful tool. It's not the only tool, I'm sure, but I do think it's a really powerful tool to automate some of these distributed problems. And obviously the final piece, which is the call to arms, is as practitioners, we could drive and build out these missing components. If you want to know any more, AutoTrader have an engineering blog, so the data teams that I work with and platform teams, and actually lots of teams, do write lots of articles about what we do. We like to be transparent, so you could go and log in there. Of course, if you actually want to come work with us, we're always hiring people, so, there, or ping me on at Darren Haken or all sorts of platforms, and I can talk to you. Well, that's it. So that's questions. Oh, that's it. Should we start with you, as you asked?
Sure, it's really a trivial question. How did you determine ownership of the DBT models? So that slide where you said mentioned 20% owning those models, how did you determine that?
We did it so that metadata block, that basically we looked and said that block was lacking that field. And so, right. When we introduced this metadata, we took a snapshot, we invested for a little while, asked teams, can you add? We basically gave them the sort of a 3-month grace, please add it, and then we did a review. Actually, it was more like entropy that happened with the software, so we thought we'd gotten into a place where the metadata was all captured, and then we had an incident, and then we looked and said, actually, about 20% of our models don't. What's happened there? And that's when we introduced a policy to say, right, let's cut that off now, let's stop it. And I think we almost had like a naughty list, so that the builds could carry on, but the naughty list needed to get smaller over time, and that's what we've been trying to work on. But it's all been driven through the metadata existing with the DBT models.
Yeah, the question was formulated before you made the metadata approach. So I was thinking maybe you looked at Git commits or.
Right. Yeah. No.
Yeah, but you already. It's a nice approach.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we had to look at metadata, actually, because you can start to infer things through what I guess it would be described as technical metadata, like Git commits, BigQuery will tell you things, but after a point, you're guessing, and so it's easier just to say, let's enforce, like, telling us about these things. And we've done similar stuff in operational systems, so, like, we automatically create Slack channels for alerts and stuff in microservices and other things, so it's, we apply it across the platform.
So do you guys still use the DBT mono repo?
We're trying to move away from that mono repo, and we've been trying to get this metadata in place so we could do that. securely. So we're going to try and build out more metadata that sort of does automated provisionment of some of the, like I mentioned around sharing responsibly. We want to use the metadata to say, I'd like to use your data, then you say, okay, and then we'll automatically create like service accounts and permissions in our cloud provider to say that's okay, and we'll drive that through metadata. So it's like a policy then between teams. So we're trying to get more of them components in place to sort of move away from the monolith. You had a question?
Yeah, some really nice ideas there, thank you.
Thanks.
Quite specific, how do you expose the metadata to the services like Monte Carlo?
Right. When you do a compile in DBT, it generates what is called a manifest file, which is essentially a big JSON. It's huge, actually. It's a huge JSON file, and that contains all the metadata. So we've parsed that, traversed it, and then we push it out to these systems. We're actually looking at Data Hub, and the community is looking at how you can do sort of actions out, so you could push data into your central metastore, and then it could trigger out actions from there. So I think eventually we'll do that model instead. So we'll essentially just index all the data into the metastore, and then have a set of events off the back of it, and then that could go into the rest of the ecosystem like Monte Carlo. But this is kind of this is why I want more emerging standards and growth to happen in these catalogs, because it can really change the architecture that we build as well. Yeah?
What happens now if like one of those quality metrics fails? So you showed like the Slack alert, but does it also lead to downstream workflows? You mentioned you showed the entire huge graph.
Yeah.
Do those workflows get stopped if a quality metric fails, or is it like you essentially have to send out a warning to the entire organization, like, hey, the quality metric failed, the rewards might be really wrong?
Yeah, so Monte Carlo is a monitoring tool, not a testing tool. So everything will be in production, I guess. So it'll be a legitimate production incident. So the model we're doing more is we notify. It is tricky though. I mean, we've got the same problem with operation systems, because you've got a graph of people that get notified, but some people might get notified and can't do anything about it because it's an upstream problem. And so there's challenges with how to do that. But yeah, we're just notifying, but we're also looking at how we do more testing, which is another unsolved problem actually in data and analytics. There's no incumbent of that, but again, emerging. But yeah, that's what we're doing. We're just letting people know, which is better actually, because before people would find out and tell us, which is not good. Which is where like Monte Carlo and other observability tools are yet again another emerging tech platforms that just haven't existed for years in data. Yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
Do you actually use, like, for example, you showed metadata about like PII? Is
Yeah.
it actually something that is enforced? So, for example, you use BigQuery. Are the permissions on the BigQuery tables edited based on the metadata?
Yes, they are. Yeah, so they get stored in a different data set essentially that doesn't get access. So that's something we've done recently. It's not actually been a huge problem for us, because the strategy we've always had to be compliant with GDPR, but also just for the general good practice of data privacy, is anonymization over personal data. So I think like we've got very, very minimal volumes of personalized, of data that we know people about. We tend to anonymize before it even comes into the analytical world, because most of the time people don't actually need to know that it was Darren. They just need to know that I did a thing and it was some sort of hashed hidden value or whatever. Any questions from anyone else? I mean, you could grab me afterwards if the list is huge.
Yeah.
I've got 2 minutes, so. Any other questions? All right, well, thanks for coming along. Hopefully you've kind of taken something away from it. If you want to ask me anything, come grab me, message me online. But yeah, try and contribute to this space. It's exciting, and there's a lot we can all contribute. Thanks.